The Honourable Member for Kitchener Centre.
Madam Speaker, we remain in a climate crisis, one that requires urgent action if we hope to leave a livable planet for future generations. And so I rise this afternoon to continue to press on this government to do better on their commitment to cap big oil's emissions, following up on a question I asked back in December, because it was over 3 years ago now, November of 2021, when the Prime Minister first said, quote, "We'll cap oil and gas sector emissions today and ensure they decrease tomorrow at a pace and scale needed to reach net zero by 2050. Sounds nice, particularly when emissions from oil and gas in 2021 were 189 megatons, an increase of 88% since 1990 and 28% of Canada's total emissions. Now, beyond the nice words, let's be clear, this commitment, even in its original form, didn't follow climate science to begin with. First, because it only committed to cap oil and gas emissions and not production. This is a significant issue because if we hope to hold global average temperatures below 1.5 degrees C with even a 50% chance of doing so, Canada would need to do its fair share of what remains of the global carbon budget to achieve this goal, and that would mean we'd have to leave 86% of our proven fossil fuel reserves unextracted. And so it's clear we must address not only emissions, but also production as we shift to other energy sources. Second, though, net zero by 2050 isn't worth the paper it's printed on if we don't do our fair share of what is required to limit global warming to no more than 1.5 degrees C in the short term. This means reducing by at least 60% below 2005 levels by 2030, along with international support in emissions reductions across the global south, equivalent to another 80% of Canada's 2005 emissions. And yet still, in the 3 years since, this government has continued to weaken and even delay this insufficient announcement. To start, the emissions reduction plan in 2022 said the cap would decrease oil and gas emissions by 79 megatons to 110, aligning with the 40% target of 40% reduction from 2005 levels from 2030. As I shared, that already is less than what climate scientists tell us is required. But then the minister promised it would all be done and in place by the end of 2023. Then all we got by the end of 2023 was a framework for discussion. And in that framework, it was full of loopholes. And so now that 79 megatons that were promised dropped by more than half. Another now down to only 34 megatons projected to be reduced by doing things like exempting 20 megatons from downstream oil refining and pipelines, and exempting another 25 megatons more for compliance flexibility is a code word for buying offsets. And now we know this weekend cap won't even be in place until 2026. How could this have happened? Well, in the 2 years since, Big Oil put a full-on campaign pressing this government with 2,000 meetings, 3 meetings a day, 7 days a week, no days off, and clearly it must have worked. And so my question again this afternoon, will this government put an end to these meetings with Big Oil and put our children's future ahead of their greed and place a real cap on Big Oil's emissions?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change and the Minister of Natural Resources.
Madam Speaker, the science is clear. Greenhouse gas emissions must be reduced significantly and urgently to avoid the most severe impacts of climate change, like wildfires, droughts, hurricanes, and the associated impacts and costs to human health and infrastructure. It has been frustrating in this place to see that most of the debate has been focused not on how we're going to fight climate change and put our best foot forward, but a fight with the Conservative opposition about whether there should be a fight at all. We are committed. Action on climate change is essential to avoid natural disasters impacting our communities. These disasters impact clean air, damage our homes and workplaces, and result in large costs, be it to individuals through increased costs of insurance, or to governments to invest in adaptation, cleanup, and rebuilding. We owe it to the future generations, our communities, children, and grandchildren to take action. And we can do the hard work to fight climate change now Or we can pass on the natural disasters and increase costs to the next generation. I and our Liberal government believe in the necessity to take climate action now, as an economic necessity and as a matter of generational fairness. Capping and reducing emissions from oil and gas sector is an essential part of this effort. The oil and gas sector is Canada's largest source of greenhouse gas emissions and one of the only parts of the economy where emissions continue to grow. In December, the federal government published a proposed regulatory framework for the emissions cap for comment. The oil and gas emissions cap will apply to emissions. That is what the atmosphere sees, and that's what we must reduce. It will ensure that the sector invests in maximum technically achievable decarbonization to achieve significant emissions reductions by 2030 and to get on a pathway to net zero emissions by 2050. No other country has capped emissions from oil and gas production. As the world's fourth largest oil and gas producer, Canada has a responsibility to address these emissions. But it's also important to get the details right. The regulatory process that the government is following is rigorous, open, and transparent. Our regulations are evidence-based, and costs and benefits are assessed thoroughly. We are working closely with provinces, Indigenous partners, civil society, and industry, while remaining attuned to considerations such as the need for ongoing investments to significantly decarbonize the sector. We also need to minimize the risk of carbon leakage. That is, to avoid Canadian production simply being replaced elsewhere in countries where weaker GHG emission standards apply. We are committed to a cap on emissions from oil and gas that works, and I hope to be able to provide a further update shortly.
The Honourable Member for Kitchener Centre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to start by agreeing with the Parliamentary Secretary that the debate in this place on climate has been reduced over the last number of months, but we can't allow this false debate about the carbon tax, which is the most efficient way of taking action on the climate crisis, from taking us away from what must be done to follow the science. And so she spoke about taking action now. On that point, I agree with her as well. The concern is the amount of time it's taken since this commitment was first made. It's true no other country has a cap. Well, neither do we still. It's been 2.5 years. We need to see this move more quickly, but we also need to see it be stringent enough. We need to see these loopholes eliminated to ensure that the reductions come at least even closer to what we must do to follow the climate science between now and 2030. And so to follow up, will she commit to pressing this government to reduce their meetings with big oil, which have only gone up in the time since, that has directly happened at the same time while these loopholes has increased, and will they...
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, I take issue actually with any implication that we are not fully committed to taking action on climate change and that we are not battling every single day to make sure that it is not only done, but done right by Canadians, done right by Canadian industries, done right to make sure that we have the jobs of the future for Canadians, which is exactly what we've been voting on in this place for the past day. We are committed to continuing the work. We have put forward a framework for an oil and gas cap, and it will be put in place, and I look forward to the member opposite working to make sure that that happens.